Welcome to this webinar on the security situation in the Sahel, which is part of a series of webinars on the Belgian foreign and defense policy. My name is Nina Willen, and I am the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Institute, and I will be the moderator of this event, which will host 4 excellent speakers, whom I will introduce in just a minute. And this webinar is an annual event which is co-organized by the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, the Egmont Institute, the Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve, and Ghent University. And earlier this week, we had a webinar on multilateralism and the UN Security Council. And on Friday, the 18th, we will have a third and final webinar in this series on the topic of children in armed conflict, a topic which has been high on Belgium's agenda during its time in the UN Security Council. You can still register for this event. And today we're turning the attention towards another topic that is high, not just on the Belgium's agenda, but on the global agenda, the security situation in the Sahel region. And as you know, this is a region which is currently facing a number of overlapping challenges, including political underperformance, socioeconomic grievances, widespread poverty, and an expansion of terrorist and criminal networks. This situation has led to a heavy international presence in the region, including but not limited to a large UN peacekeeping mission, a large French counter-terrorism operation, 3 EU missions, and the creation of a new Special Forces Joint Task Force. This is, of course, in addition to regional organizations that are operating in the region, such as the joint G5 Sahel Force and the MNJTF against the Boko Haram. And today we will look a bit closer at this region, focusing both on the current context, but also on specific actors such as Belgium, of course, but the EU and the UN as well, with the help of our 4 speakers. And I will now introduce the 4 speakers who will have 15 minutes each to speak before we open for Q&A. We have a large audience today with over 200 participants, so I am counting on you to ask interesting and relevant questions in the chat window that you can find to the right on your screen. And I will then bring up these questions during the Q&A sessions, and our speakers will have the possibility to answer them. And so now I'm coming to the important part, the introduction of our speakers. Our first speaker today is Annick van Kalster, who is the Director of Bilateral Affairs at the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. General Jean-Paul de Koning is our second speaker. General de Koning is the former force commander of MINUSMA and previously the Belgian Land Component Commander. Delina Goxo is our third speaker. Ms. Goxo is an independent security analyst at the Open Society Foundation, and you can see some of her recent publications on the Sahel in the chat window to the right. And finally, our 4th speaker today is Andrew Lebovich, who is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who also has produced a significant number of publications on the region. And you can also find the 2 latest one of him in the chat window. So with those words, I'm finally stopped talking, and I'm giving the floor to our first speaker. Annick van Kalster, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to Egmont, to you, Nina, for inviting me to this seminar. We will indeed look at a subject that is focused for Belgium, a priority area. And I'll first give some context. You already gave a little introduction before I go a bit deeper into the situation, our priorities, and look a little bit also to the future. Since some time already, as Belgium, we are concentrating our official development aid and our humanitarian aid in fragile countries, in the least developed countries. So this means that we have been present in the Sahel since some time already. The destabilization of the region, the spread of terrorism, of violent radicalism, are also a source of concern for Belgium. They are a direct threat to the West Africa sub-region and a little bit less directly, but still to the EU and to the southern neighborhood of the EU. You could say that Sahel is in a kind of second belt from the EU. The Sahel has traditionally been a transit region. It is now also a transit region for irregular migration, which is also a very important theme, as you know, in a European environment. And more we see that it is also an important geopolitical theater, a theater where influences are up against each other and where we see an opportunity as Belgium, as EU, to defend our values of poverty reduction, of fight against climate change, because this is also an important threat and challenge for the region, defense of human rights, of course, promotion of peace and security, and also an effective, efficient multilateralism. Now, you were already referring to it, Nina. The Sahel crisis is complex. It's multi-dimensional, it's multi-layered. It's a kind of lasagna with a socio-economic and a humanitarian crisis, a political crisis, and a security crisis. And so next to that, we see multiple layers of violence. There is the one that is maybe most seen or focused into in Western Europe, which is the terrorist jihadist violence. But there is also a lot of local violence, which is both between and inside communities. There is also violence because of the action of self-defense groups. And why are these self-defense groups there? Well, because we see that defense and security forces, national ones, are not always present on the field. And when they are sometimes also a source of violence because of exactions they commit. There is also the problem of illicit trafficking and criminality that bring a level of violence with them. So complex environment, different layers, international, national, and all the factors mixing up. There are a number of initiatives, institutional initiatives that emerged to stabilize the Sahel. A number were already mentioned, but the main ones are G5 Sahel, created by the region in 2014, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. What did they want to do? Cooperate in the field of development and security with also a joint force. And then this year, the Coalition for the Sahel, with the idea to mobilize and coordinate the partners of the G5 Sahel. Now, we see that there has been a huge international effort, a huge investment of the international community in the Sahel. And nevertheless, the security situation continues to deteriorate. If we look at numbers, according to UNOWAS, for example, the number of victims of attacks in the Sahel Central has multiplied by 5 between 2016 and 2019. The ACLED figures identify 4,660 deaths as a result of violence in the first half of this year. It was only, but still much too high, 4,000 over the same period in 2019. So when we zoom in now to Belgium, what can Belgium do? What are we doing to help stabilize the region? For us, the starting point is that the Sahel's crisis should not only be framed in terms of security and support to security sector. It is a firm, a basic belief also of Belgian foreign policy, Belgian diplomacy, that security alone is never an answer to a crisis. You need also to have a political solution to address the political dimension, to give it the place, the space it deserves. We see in the Sahel the erosion of state legitimacy. We see that there is an absence of the state in many parts of the region, and that there are a lot of shortcomings in terms of democratic governance. And this breach in the social contract is at the heart of the Sahelian crisis. So if we want to reply to that as Belgium, as a member of the international community, we need to acknowledge this political dimension and facilitate the emergence of a reformed state. And you will later see it's something we really put a lot of stress on.
We need states that deliver essential basic social services to the citizens. This is about education, health, infrastructure, very basic things. And a state that is seen as legitimate, including in the periphery, not only limited to a small part of the country. So reinstore this social contract. So security response is essential, but alone it will not be sufficient to stabilize the region. So we have to look how we can put together a more global answer. So how we do that, looking into this multidimensional sector, well, we try to mobilize all the actors, all the instruments we have in our foreign policy in what we call a global approach. What do we do inside Belgium? Well, we have regular exchanges of information between all actors. We develop a joint analysis of risks, of challenges, of opportunities. From there, we define joint objectives and coordinate our action. And in this way, we can build synergies. We can use in the most efficient way the means that are available. As Belgium, we have a part of the action, but of course, we are also embedded in the actions of the European Union. We believe that the EU is a powerful lever to mobilize and coordinate also the international efforts towards the Sahel. In Belgium, in our action, we focus on three axes. And for us, they are complementary. The first one, this is the one with which we have been also present already since a longer period, is development cooperation and humanitarian aid. It is a priority, the Sahel region. We had 145 million for the period 2017-2019, and also next to that, humanitarian aid. And there we want to look in particular to the protection of people, to the preservation also of the humanitarian space. And we are supporters of working better together, and the team Europe approach in the field, of course. So first axis, development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Second axis, diplomacy and political action. We have also politically strengthened our presence in the Sahel in recent years. We used to have one embassy and two development offices. Now we have three embassies in the region, in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso. It allows us to have an assertive political dialogue with the partner countries. We do this alone, but also together with other EU member countries, with the EU delegations. And we believe that together we can really convey a strong political message through coordinated high-level meetings, result-oriented political consultations also. We also think it is very important to be active, and we are very active in the European Council discussions on the Sahel. For example, recently we have been very active in shaping the revision of the EU Sahel strategy. Now, what do we defend there? It's a more assertive and a more political engagement in the Sahel. It is an engagement where we ask our Sahelian partners to commit to the values that we consider to be essential to come to a sustainable long-term solution. It is democracy, good governance, security, also fighting against impunity, and security, of course, respecting all the rights necessary. We really think that we have to put the responsibility, the primary responsibility to exit the crisis with the Sahelian authorities, and as external, as foreign partners, we need to ensure that there is local ownership, mutual accountability, and do also the capacity building that goes with it, of course. EU engagement, next to it also, of course, United Nations Security Council. We have been, we still are for 2 weeks a non-permanent member until the end of this month. And there we are also fully involved in the discussions on Mali, on MINUSMA, on the G5 Sahel, or you know what. So two dimensions we already spoke of, the diplomatic one, the development and cooperation, development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Third axis, security and the rule of law. Right now, the Sahel region is the first region of operations of the Belgian defense. There are about 200 military currently deployed in the region. What do we do there? Well, our defense participates in the strengthening of the military capacities of the G5 Sahel states, and there with a particular attention to respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. You will not be surprised following what I said earlier. Through bilateral operations, and this mainly in Niger, which is the first bilateral partner of the Belgian defense. There is a model capacity building operation with about 95 people deployed. We are also participating in the EU training mission in Mali with about 10 people, and also to the peacekeeping efforts in MINUSMA, again about 95 persons. Security, rule of law, there are different aspects. There is, of course, a defense aspect, but also internal security and justice are very important in the stabilization of the Sahel. And there we see that the Belgian Federal Police and Justice have many experts in the European CSDP missions and also in key positions in UCAP. In addition, there are several important programs in support of the security sector in Burkina Faso and in Niger that are executed by Enable. And those are executed with Belgian or European funding. Very often we also see there an involvement of our federal police. So 3 axes of engagement. Now, how do we look towards the future? We will continue as Foreign Affairs to coordinate with all relevant federal departments, with all actors active in the Sahel. So mainly defense, development cooperation, police, justice, Enable, but there might be other partners, to lay down common objectives of this Sahelian policy, notably by defining common objectives, by principles that will guide our action, both at the bilateral and EU multilateral levels. So we can build synergies and make this efficient use of our resources. When it comes more specifically to our commitment to support the security sector, double objective. One, to optimize the deployment of defense by increasing its operational added value in the field. And second one is to ensure that there is a good articulation between the bilateral and the multilateral actions, and this in line with the goals of the global approach in the region. Right now, you know, we have a government, a full-fledged government since a little more than 2 months. A number of basic options have been taken already, but a number of other ones are still on the table being studied, and one, well, including those on the table, we have continuation and strengthening of Belgian participation in UTM Mali. Also looking at the reorientation of our participation in MINUSMA towards support for the targeted training of United Nations units. There is a study, we are studying a deployment of a combined arms tactical subgroup, and this could be part of the Operation Barkhane. And in Niger, we are looking towards the evolution of our bilateral cooperation towards effective support on the ground, there also in order to maximize the added value according to the declarations that were made on governmental level. Decisions will be made by the Minister of Defense on the basis of an interdepartmental analysis, and this shows this global approach. This is an ongoing process, so looking at it from the military and the political side and having a discussion. So here I will round off my introduction. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to the exchanges that will follow.
Thank you so much, Annick van Kelster, for this excellent overview of Belgium's engagement in the Sahel region. And as we could see, there were 3 different axes. It was the development axis, the bilateral, the diplomacy, and the political one, and then the security and rule of law. And we will certainly discuss this more during the Q&A. But before that, I will give the floor to General de Koning, who will give his perspective after his experiences in the MINUSMA. Jean-Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I guess you hear me. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Nina and Egmont, for inviting me to this session. You know that part of myself is still in the Sahel and in Mali, so it's great to have that opportunity to show my commitment and my support when and where I can, my support to the Sahelians. I prepared some slides. I guess it's visible. Nina?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you. I will start with this. This is the map of the region we are talking about. Not only the well-known G5 countries, but also the Gulf of Guinea countries and Nigeria and Cameroon. The situation in Sahel is indeed worsening. I read the last report of the UNSC on Mali. That kind of report drafted by the mission itself is usually optimistic, but not this time. There are only bad news in the three main pillars of stabilization: the political one, the security one, and the humanitarian one. The UN do not report on Burkina nor on Niger, but through our channels we can see the same negative evolution in those two countries as in Mali. The question is why? An answer on that question requires a good and shared understanding of the root causes of the crisis in all its dimensions. It will be perhaps a kind of duplication of what Annick von Kassel said on stabilization and the pillars and the action to be taken. What are those dimensions? Security, of course, but also political, humanitarian, social, cultural, religion, economical, geographical, demographic, historical, and so on, and not to forget the climate change. And all those dimensions are linked with each other. I will speak mainly about the security dimension. That's the one I'm used to work in. Who is the important? Well, the violent extremist groups, which in the main roles Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, those are linked with organized armed groups or militias, already mentioned, groups compliant or not, and linked also with criminal networks. Those two main actors, Al-Qaeda and IS, are day after day extending their footprint, control, and negative influence. Why? Because the pressure by the deployed forces is not strong enough, because they can easily recruit in local population, because they are somehow accepted by the population as protectors, and because the state is not enough present to provide basic services, reliable justice, close security, education, employment, and so on. And because the national DSF, Defense and Security Forces, when they intervene, are often too brutal against their own population, and because the extremist leadership is also able to exploit local opportunities by reinforcing local extremist group with money, with finance, with equipment, know-how, and guidance. On our side, we have the National Defense and Security Forces and the international forces. One could say that the total deployed military strength is more than sufficient to cope with the threat. It is not, because of the limitations of each of the actors. To start with the local, the national GSF, with a focus on Mali, Burkina, and Niger. That is the weak Central Sahel. Those DSF are not or unprepared for the crisis. They all must be rebuilt. And at the same time, they must be redeployed, at least in Mali. And at the same time, they must operate. And that's a huge challenge in the current violent environment. The national DSF need therefore the support from the international community in the short, in the mid, and in the long term. They need training, advice, assist, and accompany, a complete mentoring system. In the ideal case, we should add equip to those 4 actions. Second, the G5 Joint Force. I won't speak about the MNJTF, I don't know that, that topic, but the G5 Joint Force is the sum of weak national capacities. The EU fully supports the G5 military capacities with a huge budget. It's already mentioned, but the effect of that support will be seen at best in the midterm. It's about capability development in concerned countries, and mainly Mali, Burkina, and Niger. Not only about urgent measures in terms of equipment and compounds. Next, amongst the international missions, EUTM Mali, that mission is limited to Mali, but will be extended as from next year, I think, to Burkina and Niger, which is a good thing. But EUTM is focusing on training at tactical level and advising at the operational level. Mentoring is missing because it's too risky for the EU capitals. However, the new mandate of EUTM could encompass that essential task to be confirmed. As already mentioned, Belgium takes part to the EUTM with some individuals in the training and in the advisory pillars, but 2-3 years ago had up to 100 military engaged, and mainly in the force protection. Next, MINUSMA, the one I know, the UN mission. That is not a security mission, it's a stabilization one. Its effectiveness is limited if we consider the ends, means, and ways defined by the UN. The ends are expressed in mandate. The mission is limited to Mali. The mission is not authorized to act in counter-terror. That mission has a Christmas tree mandate and is highly dependent on the national will to engage reforms to implement the peace agreement, for instance. The means are limited with regard to the tasks. In theory, the military means match the needs, the tasks to perform, but in practice not. If you put those tasks in a current, real, violent environment. Some critical capacities and enablers are still missing. Some contingent on the front line are ill-equipped and ill-trained. And that is why, for instance, Belgium is providing some kind of training for those contingents. The ways, the methods, I won't elaborate on that point, but the way the UN is doing business and I mean policies, procedures, doctrine, mindset. That way of doing things is perhaps aligned on its DNA and values, but does not fit in such a complex, harsh and violent environment. It's already mentioned. Belgium takes part to the MINUSMA with a recce platoon till mid 21, and with some individuals. It's not a symbolic presence, because we had in the past a C-130, for instance, and two helicopters in H-90. So we are, well, Belgium is always focusing on critical capacities, and that is the role of the Western countries. Barkhane. Barkhane is focusing on counter-terror and on mentoring of the national defense forces. But Barkhane is overstretched over the five G5 countries. Barkhane is being reinforced step by step by some EU partners. Good thing. And the operation is reaching some tactical objectives, and in some occasions it is containing the threat. EU partners matter. All those national and international deployed forces are complementary. But there are limitations to a efficient coordination and synergy between them. Just to give you some examples, the MINUSMA force cannot support Barkhane when it comes to counter-terror operations, or cannot support the G5 Joint Force with intelligence, logistics, or medevac beyond the Malian border. And beside that, the bilateral support to local DSF is difficult to identify and impossible to control and even to coordinate. This impacts some lines of development like doctrine, training, or equipment. Shortly describe the military actors and their limitations. In the short-term perspective, to act urgently against the main threat, or even to contain the threat, we must face huge limitations, but we reach some limited achievements. We are sometimes successful tactically, locally, temporarily, but we are not able to win the current battle. At the strategic level, aiming at the long term in security domain, I point out the lack of vision and of leadership for a effective SSR, security sector reform. SSR encompasses, amongst others, a model for the DSF, a more inclusive and coherent model for those forces. It covers also capability development, security governance, justice, border control, counter-criminality, counter-trafficking, and so on. The international partners can contribute to a coherent effort, but the question is, are the local capitals willing to accept such an advising of or leading support from outside? And if yes, which international body will take the lead, taking into account the interest of the involved actors? SSR is urgent, but aims at effectiveness in the midterm. We know that for years, but hardly nothing happens. So far, the security domain. But as Annick von Kassel said, putting the effort on security is not enough. We must understand and take into account the other dimensions of the Syrian crisis. All the dimensions are interrelated, and the solution for the crisis, if any, must be explored in all the dimensions. I'm not a specialist in the other domains that than security, but here's my opinion on some of those dimensions. In the political domain, the poor or even failed governance is, according to me, one of the root causes of the Sahelian crisis. The level of acceptance of foreign influence to improve the governance and the political system as a whole is low. Power and money matter for the regimes in place. Just ask for yourself. Only in Mali, since the independence, we observed 5 rebellions and 4 coups d'etat. For what reasons? Second, the social cohesion is about to be broken in central Sahel. The lack of confidence is growing between communities, Fulani, Dogons, Bambara, Tuaregs, on the national ground, but also across the borders. The tensions are due to unsolved ground competition, and I mean unsolved by states, and are fueled by violent extremist organizations. Development is a pillar of stabilization. That's right, but the question is, are we, the Westerners, doing the right things when we spend billions of euros in basic services and taking over the role of the hosting leadership? That is what I call old-fashioned, not effective in the long run support to development. Demography is already now a main factor of instability, but it's a long-term issue. I mean, the control of the demography is in the long-term part of the solution of the next crisis. Perhaps within 50 years, if we can start to act now. It's too late for the short term and even for the mid-term effects, but we must engage that challenge. And again, who will take the lead in that? This is a regional crisis with potential international effects. The same routes have the same effects and across the borders. The spillover from central Sahel towards the south, the countries of the Gulf of Guinea is already ongoing. We must contain the threat from those countries and thus provide an effective support to the Gulf of Guinea countries. Remember the map I showed in the beginning? Do not forget the influence of big actors. Nigeria, for instance, will become or is already a big actor in the region due to, amongst others, its demographic dynamics. Nigeria, but also Cameroon must be included in any analysis and strategy. My conclusions is, if I still have just 1 minute, conclusions on topic what to do and how to do at the strategic level. One, understand dimensions and the interest of all the actors. Second, think comprehensively, address the root causes. Again, security is a necessary condition in the short term, but won't be sufficient nor efficient in the long term without acting in the development and political dimensions. And then estimate what are the respective center of gravities and objective of the actors. And from there, define our own strategic objectives and the lines of operations in a comprehensive approach. Act in a short term in a security domain, contain the threat and reduce that threat. Act combined, I mean with the national actors, with the UN, with the African Union, with the EU, with ECOWAS and so on. And act coordinated towards synergy. And last but not least, communicate and influence. That is perhaps one of the most important lines of operation of a strategy towards the Sahel. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Paul, for that overview of the security forces in the region. And if I'm to sum up more or less what you said, is that there are several different security forces that are complementary, but there are not sufficient capacities or inadequate mandates to actually make a sufficient difference to the security situation as it stands. Um, Delina, now I would like to introduce you and give the floor to you to discuss more on the EU's role in the region.
Thank you, Nina. And also thank you for the invite and for the previous contributors who clarified quite a lot of the general situation in the region. And it was interesting to hear your perspectives on this. Although Jean-Paul's question on security sector reform, I think, is fundamental and currently without a solution. I think given all of this and also given Anik's previous presentation, there is no need for me to delve too much into what EU presence in the Sahel looks like. We all know what missions are there, what is currently taking place. I would like instead to get to the point and present a number of problems with regard to the European approach to the Sahel. It's a tiring exercise. I know that we all keep doing this, but I think it's still necessary before moving into a past constraints of this conversation and propose solutions. As what we're analyzing here and ultimately trying to find a solution to is whether a potential junior partner such as Belgium should continue taking part in multilateral interventions or focus more on the bilateral missions that is already engaged in. I think outlining the problems with the multilateral European operations is key to making a decision that is informed. So, first of all, there have been talks within EU institutions recently around this idea of transactionality or conditionality, or I mean, very many names, or the more for more approach. This means making aid in all of its forms, so also, of course, security aid, conditional on better behavior on the part of our Sahelian counterparts. Needless to say, I think there is a very wide array of problems related to this. For example, one example would be the Malian armed forces. Jean-Paul talked about this a bit as well. But what is currently taking place is that officers and soldiers are being sacked while on duty. They don't receive their stipends on time for months. They're being handled. They're being handed malfunctioning ammunition or insufficient ammunition. Their widows in some cases do not receive any sort of compensation for their losses or are being chased away from state provided homes when their husbands die. All of this means that endemic corruption, diversion of funds, and other problems that are very much structural are what needs to be tackled rather than coordination or modernization of the Malian army. So, of course, coordination and modernization and lots of other technical issues are very much important, but they should not take place before an accountable system is in place. So, naturally, there is this idea that has been put down very well by Vangi Shawa, which is that working with a FAMA, with the Malian army, is like driving a car while trying to fix it. And this, of course, makes the task particularly hard for European action in the region. There certainly also there is a mismatch, and this is the opinion of Dennis Tull in particular, in relations between EU and Malian counterparts. Malian counterparts tend to lament that they're being patronized, and they complain that support is not as swift as it should be, as Jean-Paul also outlined. This, however, should not justify turning a blind eye on a system that is malfunctioning at best and in some cases abusive at worst. Secondly, I would like to turn our attention to the ease with which the security debate is approached in Brussels. We keep saying that security is a very sensitive topic, and this is of course to some extent true because it's a matter of sovereignty, but we are treating it as a very technical problem. So reports of violence in the Sahel, in some cases, there have been victims that also come from the European region, and the crazy amount of armed groups and the fact that they are increasing shifts the burden of the conversation away from more political topics. such as, for example, good governance, which is not an enticing way of putting it, but is the truth, and the much feared in European policy circles conversations around migration. This makes some European Nordic states quite uncomfortable, and also some civil society coalitions, such as the Coalition Citoyenne pour le Sahel, for example. They don't feel very comfortable with framing the issue around security and development rather than focusing on migration and humanitarian as well. So one example, and I'm going to mention Italy because I'm an Italian national, and I think Italy is very much absent from this conversation, and it should be way more present. Italian policymakers, they don't discuss their migration policy. What they focus instead is on whether they should deploy mission and make it fully operational to Niger in 2021, instead of talking about what happened after Law 2015 was passed in Niger, making the situation in the Agadez region very problematic. Klingendahl has written a lot about how this European diktat with Italy in the front seat has diminished the flows of people to Europe, but has increased the so-called invisibility of risks. Thirdly, Nina has written that all the security initiatives are beginning to have a logic of their own, which is an excellent way to put it, I think. I believe it could also be described as a bit of a dance for influence on the part of more junior partners. One example is Estonia joining the French-led Takuba task force to showcase to France that they are on board, that they approve of French foreign policy. And it is evident that because of lack of capacity, countries like Estonia are unable to conduct an assessment over which type of intervention would be needed in the region. I'm not saying that this is not a common modus operandi. I'm just saying that influence should not be a goal in itself. And especially it should not be a goal if the contribution is comparatively so small, so actually is not even achievable. Then I would like to mention one smaller issue, which I think is quite symbolic, and I am particularly interested in this for my research, is this issue of remoteness of these operations. So aside from France, most operations in the region are what we call light footprint operations. They consist in trainings. In the case of the United States, there is a massive armed drone base in Niger. However, and I cannot stress this enough, what is perceived as remote for us is not perceived as remote in the region. So we're all intervening at the same time, and this is not as cost-free and as to be taken as lightly for people in the region. I would now move to the solutions bit. I hope I can provide a few insights and make sense of some of these problems. I would like to focus for the solutions bit on this issue of transactionality. It is quite evident that external actors such as the EU cannot force reform in a domain, that of security, if the political leaders of that country believe that this is not beneficial for them. So the golden rule is that institutional capacity cannot substitute for political will. And this is something that Jean-Paul explained as well. However, I think there are some overlapping interests between what our priorities are and what the priorities are for leaders in the region. But we should accept, and I think acceptance is the key word here, that the prioritization of these issues is very different. So for example, fight against armed groups might be a priority for EU policymakers, but maybe is much below in the list for the Malian transition government at the moment. So priorities may not be overlapping to the same extent, but negotiation is still possible. Secondly, and I have really 2 more minutes, findings from both security and development assistance literature show that countries with improved governance sectors use aid more effectively than those without. And this is, I mean, it's self-explanatory. The problem here is our interpretation of what governance means. Because if we focus as European leaders on stability and stabilization, we are going to get instances and episodes like the coup in Mali in August. If instead we focus on democratic principles, then the result hopefully should be different. People have a way of making their voices heard. Finally, By transactionality, I do not mean negative ex post conditionality. So I don't mean that, and we see this a lot in the case of United States security interventions. Whenever they have a reactive posture to human rights violations and corruption transgressions, ex post conditionality and negative conditionality, so punishment, is extremely negative and tends to strain relationships between two states. However, if we focus more on ex ante, so whenever before deployment, see the willingness of the partner, and positive conditionality, so if we provide what the EU calls more for more, then we can see a very different result. So I hope this was somewhat useful, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much for that, Delina. Excellent overview of the situation. And of course, you were stressing how it's important to look at this from a political perspective, and that the security perspective is not enough, as actually all speakers have already underlined. You've also mentioned the difficulties and the possibilities of the use of transactionality and the possibilities of tensions erupting between different states if it's used in a not appropriate way. I'm looking forward to hearing our last speaker, Andrew Lebovich. The floor is yours.
Great. Now that I'm unmuted, I want to thank you, of course, to Egmont, and thank you, Nina, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try in the time that's left to contextualize a bit some of the what we'd call the threat picture in the region, but because of the conversations that we've already had related to European interventions and the very nice framing and conceptualization about the overall nature of security issues in the region, I want to focus a bit more on particularly the implantation of jihadist groups and armed groups in the region, and the ways in which they're rooted locally, and the ways in which they're involved in local disputes and local issues. And then that'll lead a bit into the second part of the presentation, where I want to talk a bit about European interventions, but not too much, and look briefly at the efforts to engage in peace talks or some sort of negotiations with jihadist groups specifically, and the ways in which this might play out or might not, again, particularly in Mali, but within eyes of the rest of the region. And so one of the noteworthy features of jihadism in particular in the Sahel that has been neglected, I think, in past analysis, but is now much more commonly recognized, is how deeply rooted these groups are in specific communities in some cases, but also in some ways very, very broadly in ways that cut across traditional social, communal, and economic divisions. So this is an implementation that's been essential to the success and expansion of jihadist groups, particularly the Al-Qaeda affiliated Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, JNIM. And it's also been crucial to the ability to adapt to changing social and political terrain, but also a changing security environment. And this is very important, I think, when we think about the relative successes or not of European interventions, both security and political. And so this implantation of these groups has made negotiations, eventual negotiations, to some people seem to be a kind of imperative, but also a very deeply fraught and difficult affair for regional governments and difficult for the international community. We've seen this even in the sort of back and forth within the French government about whether or not negotiations would actually be acceptable or even possible with jihadist groups. And so this poses a real challenge also because regional governments are often unwilling to engage in some of the introspection or to make the real concessions to the kinds of deep political and security governance reforms that are often necessary and that are often demanded and needed by local communities. And so it's also very important to note that these demands are not just demands of the international community, but that there are real needs of Sahelian populations that are often going unmet, and that also has to be foregrounded in this conversation. So as JNIM and also as the Islamic State affiliated group, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, have expanded in the region, they've also come into conflict with each other. And this has really been about a mixture of local rivalries, but also some very real ideological differences that have fueled this competition, and also led to different conflicts and also accommodations with the same local communities that are such an important part of this story. These clashes have taken place periodically since last year, and even as recently as this week, pitting these two groups against each other. But again, they, as I want to keep pointing out, that they have both a local register and more of a regional dimension as well, and that they also respond to each other and respond to outside pressure. So of course, most recently, the ongoing French operations, the very aggressive French operations that have taken place in the last couple of months in particular, may have created a bit more space, for instance, for the Islamic State affiliate to return a bit more to parts of Mali where they had been largely pushed out of as recently as a few months ago. And I also want to emphasize that that while some of the contestation between these groups, as I said, owes itself to these kind of personal rivalries and tensions between commanders and fighters, it does take place in an ideological and also particularly religious register, and religious debates come up quite often in these discussions and in the disputes between them. But also at the same time, the advantage has largely been, I think, so far to that of JNIM, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, in part because, again, it has a fairly well-organized structure, and it has adapted, in some cases, quite well to these local social and political conditions. And so in some cases, we've seen local commanders, particularly for the Katibat Messina of JNIM, a part of JNIM largely, but not exclusively, in central Mali, where local commanders exercise significant judicial authority, significant authority over taxation, and have set up in some cases their own parallel judicial systems in areas like Mopti and Segu in central Mali, that have in some cases even led civilians to travel from more urban areas into more rural areas to seek out this judgment, because in some cases it has been seen in the past as more effective than Malian courts. And so this is a really important issue, on the one hand, when we think about the prospect for negotiations with groups, but also when we're thinking about international interventions, and what both Jean-Paul and Delina have brought up, this question of calibrating our interventions and calibrating what's possible. Because of course, we see not only the failures of state legitimacy in some places, but we see a very direct impact from these insufficiencies of state capacity, but also abuses committed by the state, particularly in Mali, but also by those affiliated with the state. And so this is also where it's important to remember that we talk a lot about jihadist groups, but jihadist groups are by far not the only armed actors involved. And again, Mali in particular has a very complicated sort of universe of armed actors that also involves local militias, communal defense groups, larger militias and armed groups, some affiliated with the state, some not affiliated with the state, particularly the signatory armed groups of the 2015 Algiers Accords. But we also see elements of this in Burkina Faso and even in Niger that make these local arrangements and local calculations very, very difficult. And what we've also seen is, of course, as the security situation has fragmented in Mali in particular, in some cases, the jihadist groups, particularly again JNIM, have been among the only, we can say, security groups that are actually cut across communal lines very frequently. And so this is a big problem, particularly as these communal militias have become much more active over the last few years and more involved, in some cases, in government-led or government-associated counterterrorism operations. And these groups, another thing to remember is that these groups, combined with national defense forces, sometimes account for more violence against civilians in particular than jihadist groups do. Though, of course, this varies from place to place and from group to group. But as a result of this, jihadist groups, particularly JNIM, have at times been seen as more reliable guarantors of security and local conflict resolution and mediation than the Malian government. And this really should give us pause when we think about how international interventions are structured and how they approach things like building governing capacity. And it's also important to keep in mind because oftentimes in the international discussion, and particularly in the discussion around the Coalition for the Sahel, for instance, as well as the Sahel Alliance before it, we hear a lot of mention of trying to bring the state back to areas where the state has been removed or where it's less absent. But then the question should not only be about bringing the state back, but what kind of state comes back, particularly in these places where state institutions and their allies have often been seen as predatory or abusive. And again, we've seen real limitations to the ability of international military operations to buttress the state, even in areas where it shouldn't be quite as difficult. So, for instance, for the last several years, there's been a pattern of besieging localities in central Mali in particular, and either extracting concessions and taxes from local communities or trying to put pressure on these communities to change their security arrangements in place and also change some of the economic arrangements that govern relationships between communities. And the state has been largely unable to deal with these and largely unable to guarantee the kind of local security arrangements that are needed to mediate these conflicts. And so in some cases, again, the jihadist groups, particularly JNIM, have sometimes been more successful and have continually been successful in imposing their own conditions on these localities that in some cases are also very close to Malian military bases, where this, if we're going to talk about the return of the state, we should look at the situation in places like Farabugu, in the circle of Niono, where jihadists continue to be active, even with large-scale state intervention and lots of local mediation. And so again, because the mediation cannot respond to the not only the social and political, but also the military situation in the region, it remains fairly unsuccessful. And so then to shift a bit to the possibility of talks with jihadists, I believe I have about 5 minutes left. There is an ongoing dialogue. It's often an informal dialogue with authorities and between authorities, intermediaries, and jihadist groups that has gone on for years now. And there are some prominent, in Mali in particular, some prominent religious figures, particularly Imam Mahmoud Diko, the former head of the High Islamic Council, who have at different times been somewhat successful in obtaining, for instance, the liberation of captured soldiers, but less successful at arriving at political outcomes. And so again, while these local talks have been going on, again, particularly related to local conflict resolution and the release of kidnapped officials or soldiers, these government-led efforts have largely faltered up until now, partially due to inconsistency and inconsistent approaches from the government, but also a kind of lack of consistent direction from those trying to lead the mediation. And so these informal talks are continuing, and there's an effort to kind of rekindle them now that have included communal meetings in central Mali and parts of northern Mali. But at the same time, JNIM in particular continues to expand its presence in Mopti, in Ségou, but also in Sikasso further south, and also in Koulikoro and even toward Kai, toward the borders with Mauritania and Senegal. And so what we see is an absence of a clear political strategy that's going to make any talks with jihadist groups very, very difficult, both because of the lack of vision of what to do with these groups and also a lack of agreement and a lack of implementation even of existing arrangements with non-jihadist armed groups. And so Jean-Paul, for instance, referenced the necessity of SSR and also DDR, so demobilization reintegration programs that technically exist, but have not made any real progress or not have made significant enough progress to make much of a difference. And so any sort of this process is going to be a necessity for guaranteeing a post-conflict resolution, but it's going to be very challenging. There are some models for this that perhaps we can talk about a bit in the Q&A, and some possibilities for drawing examples, for instance, from the Algerian model and the Algerian reconciliation process that helped finally bring an end to most of the violence from the Algerian civil war of the 1990s. But again, this was a very difficult process in a very different context. And right now, the jihadist groups, again, particularly JNIM, sometimes seem to hold the upper hand over the state. And so to step back a bit, one of the biggest problems that we see is that you have groups that have been able to adapt to changing local environments, not always well. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that they are somehow benign actors. They're not. They are armed actors involved in often intense violence and pressure on local communities, but they've been able to adapt to changing local environments and to changing local situations in ways that have allowed them to maintain a consistent presence, even with really significant military pressure, and even particularly really significant military pressure recently from French forces. And so as these groups expand and as they engage in things like communal peace building, we have to look much more carefully about the international interventions in the region, how the international interventions approach peace building and peacemaking, and how they approach particularly political conditions in the region. So this is where I think the point that Delina made about conditionality is a very important one, because again, we have to look ultimately at not only the effectiveness of international programming, but we have to look at sometimes being more forceful in trying to enforce the standards that we claim to want, particularly related to the protection of civilians, particularly related to governing reforms. Obviously, the countries of the region are sovereign, and that sovereignty has to be respected. But at the same time, the international community has to be honest about what can be achieved and what is not being achieved right now, and they have to adapt their responses accordingly. So, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, which outlined how complex it is with the different jihadist groups in the region and the relation with the state, which sometimes is perhaps not the kind of state that we want to rebuild, but a different types of state. So bringing the state back in does not automatically mean that we want to bring in the same type of state, but we would like to have a somewhat reconfigured state where the social contract, which Annick van Kalster mentioned in the beginning, is re-established between the local population and the state institutions. So I will start the Q&A session with a few different questions, and then I'll give you the opportunity to each of them to reply to the question that you would like. The first question is actually one of we're talking a lot about the regional approach to these different transnational challenges that the region is facing at the moment, such as climate change, terrorism, criminal networks, and trafficking. But given the many problems, and Andrew has just touched upon these, that are local problems, how important is the regional approach to this? Do we need national approaches? Do we need more local approaches to address these problems? That's a first question. A second question, which is directed towards Annick. What is your perspective on conditionality in EU's or Belgian development aid linked to limiting irregular migration from the Sahel? And I think that we could broaden this question to Delina as well, to discuss a little bit more about the conditionality aspect or the transactionality aspect that we discussed earlier about the EU's and the new more assertive strategy from the EU coming forward. And then finally, a third question before I give you the floor again. Since it's a regional crisis, why don't we see more initiatives from the main regional actor in Africa, the African Union? Why does this organization not play a more prominent and central role in resolving the different crises in this region? So we'll start with them, and I'll perhaps start with you, Annick, if that's fine, to answer the question that you would like.
Yes, thank you very much, Nina. Well, maybe on the first one,
regional approach, national approach, local approach. In my introduction, I have been speaking about the different problems, the different layers, the lasagna that exists. And when you have this kind of multi-dimensional problems, you should also treat them in a multi-dimensional way and work with different actors after consultation, of course, on the different levels. I mean, it is completely imaginary that you will, I don't know, wipe out smuggling from Mali and not from its neighbors, for example. So you will also not solve local problems or national problems by only looking at the regional level. So it is really necessary to look at the different layers that exist and go into a dialogue with the different actors that exist. And for example, when you work with development cooperation, humanitarian aid, you will look a lot at what's happening on a local level. You might, and then I jump to the last part, but you might also with African Union, with regional organizations, look more at a regional approach. G5 is a very good example of looking together at challenges. So I think everything exists. The training missions are then on a national level, being the civilian ones or the military ones. It is not or, but it's and. I think we really need to address the different ones if we want a movement going. You cannot isolate problems, but also not only focus on one level. Conditionality in development aid linked to well to limit or linked to a limitation of irregular migration. You can think about the conditionality. There is a conditionality automatically in development aid in the sense that absorption capacity working together, but not linked to illegal migration. I said that as Belgium, we have been present for a long time in the region because we want to work with the least developed countries. And our view is that absolutely development aid should not be subordinated to migration agendas. It is very important to get these countries up and running, to well, invest in building up what is possible. And we don't want to use this aid as a stick to punish if we see, for example, on the migratory agenda, things that we don't like that much.
Thank you. Jean-Paul?
I will take that one on the action or non-action of the African Union, if I may. You're right if you say that the African Union is one of the main actors and could do something to solve the crisis. But the action of the African Union, at least in Mali, I don't know, or in the Sahel, is limited to a political action, like putting the pressure on the leadership after the coup in Mali, like putting the pressure in the preparation of the elections, like the presidential election in 2018 in Mali, and I guess before the similar elections in Burkina and in Niger. So that is the most important role of the African Union. When it comes to security, I didn't feel at all any commitment of the African Union in that domain to put forward some solutions beside the setup of the MNJTF. MNJTF is acting in another part of Africa. When it comes to development, there's a link between the African Union and ECOWAS. ECOWAS is acting also as a political player, political actor, and putting the pressure. But the action of ECOWAS in the development pillar is also limited. And to come back on the African Union, do not forget that before the MINUSMA was launched in Mali, we had a first MISMA mission supported by the African Union. MISMA was launched in January 13, and was not successful because that was only limited to a military engagement. So that is perhaps a reason why the African Union is not so willing to engage in that security or military domain.
Thank you. Delina, do you want to answer the question about the conditionality and transactionality?
Yeah, I would also connect very quickly to this African Union question as well. I think, so Jean-Paul focused on the political willingness, which of course is key. I think from conversations with the political and security committee within the African Union, precisely asking this same question that was asked by one of the attendees, the issue is a lack of funds. So what he said is that they do not have the capacity at the moment. And I don't necessarily think that it would be the right strategy to have yet another force come in with a number of soldiers that would be quite low. I mean, it would complicate things as well, I think. On the conditionality question, but very, very simply, conditionality for me means applying tools that we have learned from the development and humanitarian arena, such as monitoring and evaluation, to security operations as well. If conditionality for the European Union means we will provide you with security aid if you block people at the border, that is problematic. If conditionality means applying development and humanitarian tools to the security sector, then that is a debate that I think we should have. I think the other debate is valid as well, is just way more problematic ethically and also in terms of what your foreign policy is trying to achieve. And just one quick thing on the bilateral, multilateral operations. I think what should be preferable for junior partners such as Belgium, I think from a practical, technical point of view, we should engage, smaller countries should engage in multilateral operations whenever their expertise is particularly specific and particularly needed. For example, the Italians on organized crime. I mean, they have a specific expertise there, and that they could join a specific mission and in support of that. The other issue is the foreign policy objectives. And of course, if your objective is influence and upholding multilateralism, that's fair enough, but at least internally, it should be dealt with more honesty, I think.
And thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I don't think I have very much to add. I think I would say that the regional, you do need both a regional and a local approach. The one thing that I think is perhaps a problem sometimes when there's all of a talk about a regional approach is that it leads to a lot of bureaucratic, let's say, bureaucratic confusion. And so then you have people who have to integrate all of these different levels of a discussion. And then particularly in the European arena, you end up having just kind of endless conferences and coordination meetings about coordination meetings. And so you end up creating sometimes much more of a mess just through trying to get involved and trying to then have every strategy somehow align with the other. So I think that at a minimum, the response has to be defined. It can be defined by a desire to engage in multilateral support. As Selena pointed out, it can be partially about influence, but it does have to be about, I think, developing a particular understanding, and countries have to develop their own understanding that can only come from paying attention to some of these local issues, and then maybe stepping back, because also there are always going to be particularities and contexts that have to be taken into account, even in the Gorma, even in the G5, and then beyond. And so sometimes, while I think the regional response is necessary for coordination and for a kind of broad understanding, even now when you hear people talking about the threat to as Jean-Paul said, the Gulf of Guinea countries, to the littoral states. Even then, Ghana is very different from Cote d'Ivoire, is very different from Togo and Benin, and so the situations are going to necessitate local understandings in each space and can't purely be defined by a regional or by a multilateral approach.
Thank you. We have several new questions, and I'll do another round of questions, and we'll start from the other way. So I'll start with Andrew after I've asked these questions. It has almost become a fashion to participate in different international missions in the region, and we've talked about this logic, external logic of its own to participate in different types of mission in this region. I'm wondering, is there a risk that there will become a Sahel fatigue at some point, as we've seen previously in the DRC, what used to be called the Congo fatigue and later the Congo coma, at least from a research perspective, when there was simply no initiatives anymore, or no political will to continue to engage, as the solutions didn't seem to arrive and as the crisis continued. Do you think that there is a risk that this will also happen in the Sahel, or is this a region where we will continue to invest until the situation has stabilized? I'll start with that question, and a second question is related to France's refusal to accept dialogue with terrorists and the French pressure on the new Malian authorities not to talk to such groups. To what extent is that an obstacle? And I saw earlier today that there has been a little bit of a change in the French discourse on this, but how would you perceive their stance on this? Are they more flexible in, let's say, private or in official, or are they in their public announcement? And if you could start, perhaps, Andrew, this time.
Sure. The question of fatigue is a real one, but I think yes, there is a risk of it. Again, as if states cannot define their own interest in the Sahel beyond a kind of interest in European support, then yes, I do think eventually people might, at least in European capitals, there might be some very real fatigue. Obviously, these issues are not going to go away. Certainly, the security and the political challenges of the region aren't going to go away. But I do think that there is a risk of people suddenly deciding to get very involved, but not really knowing why they're getting involved, and not having a well-defined idea of what that intervention is supposed to achieve. And so then I can see it becoming easy. We've seen this even within MINUSMA, for instance, that sometimes when results are not achieved, when results look very difficult, people pull back because they didn't have a clear expectation of what they were actually hoping to get out of their own involvement in the region. And so I do think it's a real risk, but again, one way to get around that is to have an honest discussion, like what we're doing today, about issues like conditionality, about the kind of political reforms that we might see as necessary, and just in general about the challenges that we're facing that get out a bit of the kind of intra or inter-European discussion about these issues and are really informed by what's happening in the region itself.
Thank you. Delina?
Nina, if you allow me, I would also address very quickly a few of the questions in the chat box, unless so on the Sahel fatigue, I think just direct feeling about this is too close for Europe, at least. I think in the US case, it may be different, but for Europe is really too close to be a forgotten issue, I think, and too problematic for the reasons that, for example, the EU Special Representative for the Sahel has explained. So this whole idea of a demographic boom, this whole idea of constant migration, and the fact that we connect terrorist acts in the region with terrorist acts in Europe, which is a problematic connection, but is something that is very much perceived in Europe. Within the chat box, I think I would just like to give an answer to the question around Russia, China, and Turkey. I think the perception for now from the region, last time I was in Niger was a few months ago though, so maybe this has changed, is that these powers are not perceived as particularly relevant in the security domain. So economically, for sure, China and Turkey are very present, in Niger at least, but they're not perceived to the same extent as relevant as European actors are. And then there was one question on public perceptions in Europe. I think this connects well to what I was saying before around remote warfare. So the fact that something is perceived as cost-free or light footprint, this is the reason why we don't talk about this enough. So yeah, I think we should talk about it more.
I also, sorry, just to cut in, I want to add one thing to Delina's point about this concern about Russia, China, and Turkey. This is something also that does get wrapped up in European debates and also debates in the United States, and a kind of concern, particularly about ceding space to China. But we really should remember that the involvement of states like Russia, like China, like Turkey, tends to be in different domains, and it's important to pay attention to that. But I don't think that there's a fear that that suddenly Russia is going to step in and provide the kind of military assistance, for instance, that France is providing, or even China will. There's not really much chance of that happening. Again, the interventions are different, and we can have a conversation about maybe how European interventions or American interventions can not better counter that, but better match the appeal and the implication of Russian, Chinese, Turkish involvement. But they're not similar, and they're not similar enough, I think, for a hard conversation about conditionality to impact that. There's not going to be some sudden shift to asking from China and Russia what's being provided now by France or by Europe. It's just not the same discussion.
Right. Thank you for picking up on that. Jean-Paul, perhaps if you could address the question about the ones that we've already asked, but perhaps also the synergies between different security missions and what mandates that are needed to actually have more efficiency and effects in the region. And perhaps also how the Coalition for the Sahel could assist in this endeavor.
Okay, but first on fatigue, Sahel fatigue, no way. Like Delina said, it's too close. So our job as a whole is to maintain that topic on top of the agenda of every capital in Western countries, every country in that region of Africa. It's essential. And again, it's a question of communication and influence. It's one of the most important lines of operation: communicate and influence. About the synergy between the deployed forces. The forces, I say that, are complementary. Not enough. We should allow EUTM to do mentoring, because mentoring is essential, at least in Mali, Burkina, and Niger. We should perhaps extend the mandate of the MINUSMA, extend it at least to Burkina and Niger, but that requires additional means. And you have to know that MINUSMA cost already 1 billion a year. It will require additional military assets. And you have to know that MINUSMA received in the mandate of 2019 a additional strategic objective, which is the center of the central region of Mali. The first one is still implementation of the agreement, but at the same time, the Council said you won't get any additional assets to do that. So the question of extension of the mandate of MINUSMA towards Burkina and Niger would be, in theory, a good thing, but it's not feasible, to my opinion. What we can do is perhaps lift the red lines imposed by the Council and by the UN headquarters. I mean, the red lines like to forbid the MINUSMA to support really his partners like Barkhane, EUTM, G5 and the FAMA. MINUSMA is not allowed to do mentoring. But we put that wording in the mandate of 2017. MINUSMA is not allowed to provide intelligence and to provide logistical support to Barkhane when it comes to counter-terror. Yes, but Barkhane is a key player in that domain of counter-terror. So lift those limitations, those red lines, and we could with that improve the synergy. But I think it won't be feasible. It won't be accepted by the council.
Thank you. Annick, you want?
Yes. Okay, well, I'll first come in again on the Sahel fatigue question, because of course when you have a large engagement somewhere and you don't see, it takes a long time, you don't see positive developments there to slow, or they're negative, there is a risk that your public opinion says, but why the hell are we spending so many means over there? But on the other hand, we cannot afford to say, well, we're tired of the Sahel and we'll just leave it. It's too close. There is a huge humanitarian problem. Well, I told earlier that we stepped in the region with humanitarian aid, with development aid a long time ago, because it's really, really needed. And I think we have, as players in the international community, a responsibility to make sure that we don't come to a Sahel fatigue. And General de Koning already referred to necessity to adapt mandates. I think the Coalition for the Sahel is also giving a possibility to have a better, well, global answer, coordinated answer. We need light structures, and we need to work together very well so that we can come into a virtuous circle. So that we have to have a level of ambition. We should also look at where we want to get. What is the desired end state, have an objective, and that will help us to make sure that we don't come to a Sahel fatigue. Then I see nobody answered well, Mr. Lebovic did of course speak about what will happen with jihadists. Should we talk or should we not talk? And I don't think that I should read the French mind, but we all know, of course, that all politics well, international politics are also linked to local situation, to internal situation. From our side, yeah, we see that this debate is going on, that a number of think tanks recommend including jihadist groups in the discussions. We also see that Mali, the Mali society themselves came with this idea after the National Inclusive Dialogue in the end of last year. And also the African Union, we spoke about them by the means of their Commissioner for Peace and Security, Ismail Shergi, said we should do that. When we look at the discussion, we see that it mainly centers on local jihadist groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda, not to Islamic group. And then, well, we think that it's mainly up to the Malians to see with whom they want to discuss and on which subjects. What is important, well, we say not only sectarian solution, but also, and I mentioned it in my introduction, no impunity. And so if there is a discussion, there should be clear parameters set by the Malians if they want to be credible also, if they engage with certain groups and make a framework over there. For us, GNIM, and I heard a number of rather good evaluations, they are on a list of terrorist groups since 2000.
and 18 already it's the United Nations list, but it's a question that will continue to come back. If we look a bit further than the Sahel, if we zoom out, yeah, we see that there's a dialogue going on with the Taliban. Who would have thought this would ever be possible? So it is a question we will see coming back. We feel there is no consensus right now. There is no framework in which it can happen, but we expect that there will be a reflection going on that.
Thank you. You mentioned, and I will jump on that, you mentioned the negotiations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that brings in another dimension to this discussion, and that's the question of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and how we should deal with gender equality in this region. And so far we haven't even discussed that, but that's of course also an important aspect to look at, as we know that there is enough research now to demonstrate that the greater gender equality, the less risk for instability and armed violence. So reflections on that perhaps in the next round of questions, but also more specific questions related to how terrorist groups can be strengthened or are strengthened, to what extent they are strengthened by the payment of ransom for different hostages. There's one question about the release of presumed terrorists in exchange for the hostages, and how that actually affects the terrorist groups or the Islamist groups' power in the region. That goes to all of the speakers, of course, or those who would like to answer that. Another question is specifically to Annick and Andrew. How could we implement and optimize a 3DLO, so a comprehensive approach, regionally, locally, and still be in line with the multiple national policies, being a junior Belgian partner in a bilateral involvement or a multilateral involvement? So perhaps the broader question here is, how realistic is the comprehensive approach in a region and in a setting like this? And finally, a third question. Delina answered this previously a bit about China and Russia, the role of China, Russia, and Turkey, and that there are more of economic actors rather than security actors in the region, but that doesn't really prevent them from having an effect in the power balance between different international actors. So how should we go about this, and what should the Europeans' stance be on this? Because if Europe is imposing too hard conditionalities, the person who's asking the question, then they could prefer to work with less demanding partners, such as Turkey, China, or Russia. And would that undermine human rights and democracy in the Sahel? So perhaps, Andrew, if you would like to start this round of questions.
On the 3D approach, on negotiations.
You can pick and choose.
Okay, well, I'll actually tackle the ransom question first. So this is actually very relevant in part because for years there's been a lot of attention internationally to the question of trafficking and the ways in which trafficking does or does not, say, feed the coffers of jihadist groups. But actually, ransom payments have, at least before the occupation of northern Mali in 2012, by most estimates, ransom payments made approximately 90% in some cases of the revenue of some of these jihadist groups. Now, of course, things are much more diverse, but it's undeniable that ransom payments do help provide money for jihadist groups. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. And also the release of prisoners, as happened in October, in exchange for several hostages, including the Malian opposition leader Soumaïla Cissé. That's a calculation that states have to make if they are willing to spend that money and exert political pressure in exchange for the release of their citizens. But I don't think anyone could really deny that it does help jihadist groups and that payments do go to these groups. I think that's a fact of life. To the question of an integrated approach, I think it's realistic to an extent, but again, it really depends on how objectives are defined, and having a kind of shared understanding. Now, this is actually where I think small countries like Belgium can play a role in placing more emphasis on specific values or specific concerns. We see this, for instance, with Norway, where Norway has a very long-standing commitment to issues of political mediation and to local political processes that that continue to factor in discussions where Norway is present. And I do think that smaller states can play a role in that, particularly politically. But again, a kind of 3D approach, let's say that it is very good in theory, but is still being defined. And I would say even the major or the most powerful military states in the region are still looking through what an integrated approach actually would be and trying to find the right balance. My own perspective on that, again, is that it is the political dimension that is often missing, or that that the international community often pays lip service to, but that is actually that actually should be central in these discussions, especially now that in Europe and in the United States now we're speaking much more frankly about the importance of governance. But what that means is having a strong political dimension to any integrated approach, so that we can actually look toward the medium term and the long term, not just for stabilization and conflict resolution, but trying to actually chart a more effective way forward that's not just a kind of security, development, humanitarian aid dichotomy.
Thank you. Delina?
Yeah, on the comprehensive approach at the European Union level, I think I would just address this. There are tensions, and there have always been tensions, I think, between what northern states, for example, and in the case of the Sahel, I think Germany should be added to the northern states company, and the fact that there is a stronger placement on having stronger benchmarks on whenever we provide security aid, versus the approach of southern states, which tend to try and keep it looser. And by keeping it looser, of course, you have more space for action. For example, the Italians have this focus on migration that they tend not to mention too much. The French, of course, have their own objectives. So I think even within the EU, there is this huge division between what the North and the South believe to be the priorities.
Jean-Paul, would you like to answer some of the questions?
I will perhaps come back shortly on the question or remark on strengthening the risk groups by the payment of ransoms. Like Andrew said, in October, the Malian government paid probably and released some hundreds of jihadist combatants. That was a mistake. And with that, I would like to come back on the dialogue with the negative armed groups or organizations. That dialogue is a must to avoid mistakes. And to prevent mistakes, and that dialogue is possible, not with all the leaders of all the movement, but with some of them, like Kufa for the Masina Katibat, even with Iyad, the so-called leader of JNIM. It must be possible, perhaps not directly, but through linked organizations like CMA in the north, or like or through some leaders of the Fulani community in central region. So it's, according to me, it's a must to engage the dialogue with the leaders of the so-called negative armed groups. I won't come back on the 3D DRO, but I would like to say that in Belgium, we put that wording 3D DRO or comprehensive approach in the last government agreement already for years, but it's still a wording. And I'm still waiting on real concrete achievements in that domain in Belgium. And then relationships between some of the governance in government in the Sahel region and Russia or China, for instance. I saw arriving some equipment from China equipping the Malian Defense Forces. Idem for China, idem for Russia. Why? Because at least the Malian, I won't speak about Burkina and Niger, but at least the Malian leadership is accepting everything coming from outside, from the EU, from the US, from Russia, from China, and so on. And that makes the things difficult to organize, to influence, to follow all the lines of development when it comes to capability development. Thank you.
Thank you. Annick?
Okay, thank you. Well, a lot has already been discussed. Very briefly on women, peace and security. I will not go very deep in it. For us, it's a, as you know, a horizontal line. We are mainstreaming in it in whatever we do in our intervention in the multilateral level, also in bilateral contacts. This is in line also with an important gender element in our development policy. You will remember it's not women, peace and security, but the She Decides movement that was created also by the Belgian Minister of Development Cooperation. And we also worked very much on children and armed conflict during our presence at the Security Council. We did a terrain visit 1 year ago, December 19, and now we almost have conclusions. It's under silence procedure, so we still want to continue working on these elements. 3D LO, General de Koning was also, well, everybody was referring to it. If I look at what has been going on, the evolution in Belgium, one, it's a fashionable word, we see it everywhere, but if you look at what's happening on the field, on the terrain, for us, it has been very much something bottom up to really organize all the discussions between the different actors to come to common analysis. I think everybody is a policy advisor in their own system. There has been a text agreed by the government. It's referred to the government agreement. So it is work in progress. It is getting better and better. Is it already perfect? No, it is not. It is also something we take with us within the European framework. Let's face it, we have to talk to each other. We have to make common analysis, fix common objectives, and then put our means together, because otherwise we will not go forward. We will not come to an efficient way of using our means. So for me, it's something that is moving in the right direction. That is not perfect yet, but we always have to continue working. And I think you already had a lot of answers on the Russia, China, Turkey, except if you still want more. But there's maybe other questions.
Yes, thank you. Time is ticking, so we will take a last round of questions. We have one questions for all the panelists. It's climate change ensuing desertification or degradation of the soil is recognized as a conflict catalyst and a multiplier of risks. How do the panelists see the link between climate and security? And is it already taken sufficiently into account in the various approaches towards the region? Could a more outspoken focus on security through the prism of climate change offer a new avenue of possible approaches which all the relevant actors could build on. So the question is related to how much we should try to include climate change in the security perspectives that are underway. So let's take that as the first question. A second question is directed also to all of the panelists, whether it's better to use special forces operators in the different interventions in the region, or more of a classical military structure. So the question is, the Belgian Special Operation Regiment is oriented towards an expeditionary character, working with small groups, building up understanding of local issues and players. Would the panel agree that this type of soldiers are better suited for actions in the Sahel region, or is a classic military structure better since it aligns better with the local understanding of an army? And then finally, I have a specific questions for Andrew. In terms of what has been called as the end of jihadist exception in the Sahel, how do you think the situation will evolve on the ground? Will the Katiba Masina go back to cooperate with the ISGS, or is it foreseeable that the armed confrontation will continue due to internal divisions, doctrinal controversies, and competition for the same constituency? An additional question, which is not related and which could be answered by all of the panelists, what concerns gender equality and WPS, Women, Peace and Security, that is, how likely is it to see an increase in women's participation in the peace process given the current political developments, like finally including women in the CSA and in the subcommittees? So, Annick, do you want to start perhaps this round? If there is a question that you feel that you want to address.
I already started one, so I gladly give the opportunity to somebody else to start.
I move over to Andrew, because you had a particular questions or a precise question for you.
Sure. Well, I'll actually start with the climate change question very quickly, because this is an ongoing discussion among researchers who work on the Sahel, as the question of how to actually evaluate the impact of climate change. And I think, unfortunately, because it is a real issue, certainly on a global scale, it is a real issue locally. I think the best way to frame it seems to be that it is this kind of catalyst effect on local conflict. But what it really should highlight then is the importance of integrating resource management and understanding resource management, again, from a political and a technical perspective, and also as it relates to something like the administration of justice. That's very, very important to include in international approaches to the region and to individual countries. So again, it's something that can be integrated into our understanding of conflict, but certainly should be more than just a buzzword, and should have concrete impacts, particularly, and as I said, how we look at resource conflict and resource management issues like water rights, land tenure, things like that are very, very important in the region anyway, in an environment of scarcity, and will become more important with time. To the question about the Sahelian exception was referred to, and so referring to this idea before that that ISGS and JNIM, or Al-Qaeda link groups, largely did not fight each other, largely kind of cooperated. What this is that before there was, I think, a kind of sharing of territory that has broken down, and some sharing of fighters that has broken down. I think it's possible that ongoing military pressure will lead back to a kind of modus vivendi with these groups. But I do think that for now, there's no reason to believe that these clashes won't continue. They're quite serious. In Islamic State media in particular, we've seen much more attention to these clashes. There was one again this week that appeared in Islamic State media, and again with reference to JNIM fighters as being kind of apostates, of having aligned with local governments. So I don't really think this issue is going away. I don't think the clashes are going to stop anytime soon, absent a really significant change in the political and security dynamics in the region.
Thank you. Delina, would you like to address any of the questions in the last round?
Yeah, I think just the special forces question and the climate question. On the climate question, there is very little evidence. And I think, just like Andrew said, the debate is ongoing, but so far there is no strong evidence that supports the claim that climate change increases levels of insecurity. Certainly access to land and water is very important, and the judicial should be strengthened and made better. I agree with all of this. I just don't think that there is a way for us to work on security if we access it through the prism of climate change. There is a very good crisis group report. It's called New Climate Wars. And it addresses precisely this. And it addresses the competition that arises not so much from climate change, but from actually making land more valuable through development aid and through climate change development aid that tries to block climate change. So it is actually quite counterintuitive what is taking place. A report will soon be published by a report that I just did with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which speaks to this precisely. And the person that asked the question can get in touch with me easily, I think, and we can talk about it more. On the special forces, I tend to look at special forces from the armed drones angle, so I am maybe slightly biased on their effectiveness. I think that they can be effective in some cases. I just think that what their added value is this issue of the lack of accountability and transparency, which used to be something particularly positive a while ago. I think currently, with all the amount of information that can be shared, this lack of accountability is not there anymore. So I think it makes more sense to use special forces less. But this is, I have no data to back this up.
Thank you. Annick, would you want to have a last word?
Okay, no, thank you very much. We'll not go very deep into climate change desertification, but it is something that is being looked at also from a development cooperation angle. So no big ideas about the exact links that they are, but it does create, climate change does create more needs economically and confrontations between, for example, nomads and sedentary people and so on. So fighting against climate change is important, but we would say mainly through development cooperation projects to see how we can, well, maybe not fully stop it, but at least mitigate the impact of it. And then maybe on gender equality, it's an answer that will go into two directions. There were more women in the last CSA in Mali, so this is good. When you look at the composition of the transitional government, we are not so encouraged. It is not even following what the Malian law prescribes on this. For us, it's an important point. We will continue to push politically, but we know that we go a bit against the flow. We have been talking a lot about jihadist groups. These people don't only bring arms, they also bring ideas, and the ideas about women and the role of women in society is not something that you or I would happily agree with. I did not answer before on regional influences, but a number of actors that come from outside the region or a little bit larger region also come with an ideological and a religious program, and also there you find a number of ideas that go against a more important role for women in policy, in governance, and so on. So it goes in both directions. We from our side, we will continue to engage.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the speakers for attacking a broad range of questions regarding a region that is facing overlapping challenges, as we have seen. And we've also seen throughout this webinar that these are complex challenges that have no simple answers. And we've also noticed that context matters. You need to look at these from different angles, from a regional perspective, from a national perspective, but also from a local perspective. So thank you so much to all the panelists for excellent interventions, and also for all the attendees. I would encourage you to sign up for our last webinars in this series on Belgian foreign and defense policies for the 18th of December on children in armed conflict. And this will take place between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock Belgian time as well. So thank you so much for attending this. Thank you for the attendees and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.